What's good, DMV and across the nation? This is the Commissioner's Corner of the DMV Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm Don Aduba, and on today's show, we'll recap the 2026 Washington Commanders draft, review prospects for their fantasy football relevance, and current starters whose spot may be under scrutiny with the new rookie class. Thank you all for joining the show. Please check out the Substack at DMV Commish and hit that subscribe button. And so, I know this is typically a commissioner show where we focus on the Wahoo Legacy League, and it's a forum for commissioners like myself to discuss issues in fantasy football and how to balance that as a commissioner. But on today's show, we'll be focusing on the 2026 Washington Commanders NFL draft class and how they can coincide for fantasy football relevance. And so, before we get into the names, let's look at the draft class. And the Pro Football Focus, which is a prominent publication that evaluates college and pro football players, actually ranked Washington 5th out of 32 NFL teams, giving them an A- for the wins above average metric, which basically is a measure that takes away all the noise to show if the player that was drafted actually produces more than a replacement level peer. And so Adam Peters, general manager, only had 6 picks. And so within that class, there is a general theme of those prospects where the prospects either had a power conference pedigree where every single draftee came from a Power 4 conference, the Big Ten, SEC, or ACC. And then his strategy in the draft was to pursue high-value versatility players over filling holes on the depth chart. And so positional value is a really big thing nowadays where there are certain positions such as offensive tackle, quarterback, obviously, defensive end, are prioritized over some of the other positionals such as safety, running back, and so on. It kind of correlates with the salary structure in the NFL. And so Peters really looked at whether those players could fit within the offensive and defensive sides of football in terms of versatility. However, the biggest question mark is whether those needs were addressed to help improve the football team. And so in this show, we're going to look at whether Peters did enough to address the boundary receiver position opposite Terry McLaurin. And then the other question to answer is whether the defensive needs were truly addressed. And so we'll just go right in and look at all the draft picks starting from the first round all the way down to the 7th. And we'll go with the top guy, Sonny Styles. And so this guy is a stud of a prospect. And so Sonny Styles brings lots of versatility, athleticism to the middle of the defense. He was drafted 7th overall after there was some speculation that Washington would trade for Silver Spring, Maryland native Mansour Delane, cornerback out of LSU, but the Kansas City Chiefs actually traded up to number 6 with Cleveland to pick up the LSU corner. But nonetheless, Sonny Styles is a great consolation prize, and in fact, I believe the Commanders brass felt that he was their guy on their draft board. And so let's talk a little bit more about Styles. And so Styles earned an 85.0 plus grade on PFF in both run defense and in coverage according to the PFF, providing an immediate fix for a defense in Washington that ranked 31st in EPA allowed last year, which basically measures expected points allowed in the 2025 season. And so the other great thing about Sonny Styles is he was hailed for his excellent leadership skills by the Ohio State coaching staff. And there is a article written by senior Sports Illustrated reporter Albert Breer on May 4th that quoted Buckeyes defensive coordinator Matt Patricia, who actually worked with Adam Peters at some point while they were both in New England. And so Patricia lauded Styles' ability to communicate and is extremely well liked by his Ohio State defensive teammates, which is a big deal because everybody from Ohio State's going out to the NFL draft, and many of their prospects are being picked up in the first round. So you have a lot of big egos, a lot of high-level alpha players, and they all like Sonny Styles. And this even extends out to the Washington Commanders coaching staff, where Commanders linebacker coach Ken Norton Jr. interviewed Styles during a pre-draft visit at a Washington area Topgolf, and Norton was so enthralled he wouldn't even let the guy go. I mean, there's video clips of Norton and Styles closely interacting, and there's like this kind of like this father-son bromance kind of thing going on, but it really just shows to the character of Sonny Styles and how attractive he is to the Washington Commanders coaching staff. And so it was clear that Styles is going to be the defensive face of the franchise. And so I think it was critical for the team to get Styles, because it plays in part of this mantra of getting high character guys that are going to really play hard and put in their best effort for the team. But also you have to be talented as well. And, that was the case 2 years ago when Jaden Daniels was interviewed, and they got to, and the football brass got to know his character, his work ethic, his ability, and it became a no-brainer for him to be the number 2 pick after the 2024 pre-draft process. And so it appears that Adam Peter used that same formula to find that defensive cornerstone for the next decade. And in terms of fantasy implications, Styles is a plug-and-play option that can make the entire Commanders defense streamable in fantasy leagues. He's going to be an impact option in IDP leagues due to his versatility, ability, and athleticism to get sacks. He's going to rack up a ton of tackles because of his incredible speed. He's running a 4.4 and he's got range, and he's just has a superior athletic profile. And because of that, he'll be able to get some interceptions as well. So he's going to have an impact to the defense that's similar to Eagles linebacker Zach Bond, who, if I remember hearing interviews or hearing some of the content during the Eagles football games, the Eagles players believe that Bond is actually the best athlete on their team. And there's some incredible athletes on that Eagles roster that has performed well over the last few years in Philadelphia. So he's just an incredible athlete. I think Styles is going to really make an impact immediately on the Commanders defense and be used as a chess piece in Durante Jones' defensive scheme, which he had gotten from Brian Flores in Minnesota. And so looking at the next pick in the 3rd round, Washington selected wide receiver Antonio Williams from Clemson. And so Williams is not necessarily the outside boundary receiver that a lot of fans expected. He's not the biggest guy, but he's going to be a future slot merchant. And what I mean by that is his incredible route running ability, and he has an affinity to get open. He's got reliable hands, and he's able to consistently separate from the defensive secondary. And so I think Jaden Daniels having a secondary target opposite Terry McLaurin, and with Zach Ertz, and his injury situation being up in the air, Daniels needs another target that he can rely on consistently in case the defense shifts their coverage responsibilities to Terry McLaurin. And so, in my opinion, I don't know if Williams has the upside or deep threat metrics to be a potential number 1 receiver, similar to some of the other receivers that were on the draft board. So if you looked at who was drafted after Antonio Williams, you saw another pre-draft prospect, Ted Hurst, who is a little bit bigger, has a bit more size and similar speed coming out of Georgia State. But obviously there's a level of competition that Hurst did not face that Williams did. And so there's a little bit of unrest there in terms of Williams' size, but he is a intermediate guy. And so if you look at the statistics, over 62% of his targets during his senior season at Clemson were within 10 yards, and his depth of target averaged across 4 seasons at Clemson was 8.5, which consistently ranked near the bottom out of all qualified receivers at the FBS level. And it's not necessarily due to Williams and his inability to get open or his inability to separate beyond that short zone. I mean, this could be attributed to the play design at Clemson and his quarterback, which was Cade Klubnik, another NFL prospect at Clemson. And so I think that's one knock that could limit his fantasy ceiling as a red zone target or deep threat. However, I do think Williams has the ability to be a safety valve. And in PPR leagues, he's going to be a chain mover. And he has a separation ability, which was 44% against man coverage and 50% against zone coverage, which ranked him in the 88th percentile. And so in PPR leagues, I think Antonio Williams will be a huge asset just because of his ability to beat man and zone coverages relative to other college receivers during his time at Clemson. And so I think what the Commanders wanted to really focus on during his pre-draft assessment was his character and his work ethic, and all that came out positive. He's been seen as a true professional football player, and he has, the elite footwork and route running and separation ability to make a lot of good work in the slot. And so in terms of his fantasy implications, Williams has a huge opportunity ahead of him. I've seen him be drafted in the second round of some rookie dynasty leagues. And so I think that's because he has the opportunity to be the WR2 receiver that's been vacated due to the inconsistency or a lack of availability of the incumbent Washington Commanders receivers. So Luke McCaffrey, Jalen Lane, they had been on the team last year, and they had an impact that was more limited to the special teams. And Washington did bring in De'Ami Brown and Van Jefferson, but it's not my expectation that they would take the role as a WR2. So I think Williams can come in and really solidify that position to help strengthen the rest of their receiving room. And so remember, as I mentioned earlier, Jaden Daniels lost Zach Ertz. And so there's going to be a lot of targets available for Williams to really thrive as that receiver that's not going to get as much coverage compared to Terry McLaurin. So he's going to potentially get a lot of targets, but in terms of his ability to get down the field and be a contested red zone target, I would not have that expectation. But I do think that Williams will have a Khalil Shakir type upside in his rookie season. And Shakir is a really good receiver for Buffalo, and he's a guy that can get open and can shake the best of corners. But he's not someone that's going to be a league winner in the playoffs. The third selection for the Washington Commanders is Joshua Josephs, and he was a fifth-round pick edge rusher out of Tennessee. He had 4 sacks and 3 forced fumbles last season. And for Josephs, he has the physical tools, and his RAS score was 8.51, so he definitely has some explosive traits that would allow him to get to the quarterback. And so he looks the part, but he's more of a developmental prospect who's going to likely sit behind veterans Durant, Armstrong, and free agent signings Odafe Owe and Kalavion Chason. So I don't expect a huge fantasy contribution from Josephs this upcoming season, but there was an interview that he had that was posted by J.P. Finley, and you could see that Josephs is excited to be a Commander, and he also wants to force a lot of fumbles for the defense using his wingspan and his physical traits after getting to the quarterback. So while I don't expect him to be a huge contributor, I think he's going to be a rotational, situational guy, but perhaps in training camp he could be a surprise and show that I was actually sleeping on him. So going into the next pick is Kaytron Allen, a running back drafted in the 6th round out of Penn State. He is from Norfolk, Virginia, so he's pretty local. And Allen was nicknamed Fat Man, split time with Nicholas Singleton all 4 years as a Nittany Lion uniform. And he really displayed consistency and power between the tackles, which fits David Blau's scheme. So last year, Allen had over 1,300 yards and 15 touchdowns against primarily elite Big Ten competition last season. So I'm wondering, well, how did he not get drafted higher in a supposedly weak draft class for running backs? And so if he does have a clear weakness, it is his lack of receiving skills. His breakaway speed isn't great, although he was timed at a 4.55, which isn't too slow by any means. And also his breakaway percentage, according to PFF, was 40.4%. And for reference, Jeremiah Love, who was the number 3 pick out of Notre Dame that went to Arizona, his breakaway percentage was at 52%. So it's a bit of a difference there between those two types of running backs. However, given Allen's productivity and his elite running back traits as a pure runner, he has the vision, patience, leverage of his pads, and the ability to fight through yards. I definitely believe he could be a 3-down back in this league just because of his pure running ability. And in terms of his fantasy implications, he's a goal line and short yardage handcuff at minimum. And so I see him drafted sometime in the 3rd round in rookie dynasty leagues. And he'll probably be a late round flyer, like 13, 14, 15 round pick in your standard fantasy redraft leagues. But he does have the potential to be a running back 2 or flex option if he's able to get starter carries for the Commanders. And that's because Allen consistently improved his PFF grade, ending with the 89.5 grade his senior year. He also finished in the top 10 in missed tackles forced and yards after contact at 3.77 yards after contact. So with Allen, he's able to break through tackles. As I mentioned, he broke through 57 his senior year. But he reminds me of another 6th-round draft pick that came way back in the 1995 draft. And he really terrorized me as a Chiefs fan back in the day. And he was the guy that had the mile-high salute. And that running back is NFL Hall of Famer and Super Bowl MVP Terrell Davis of the Denver Broncos. And obviously I'm not saying Allen's going to wear a gold jacket when his career is over, but his archetype suggests a throwback style running back similar to former Commander Brian Robinson Jr. And he's going to play that David Montgomery role under David Blau's system. He'd be the Knuckles to the Sonic, which was Jahmyr Gibbs when they were both in Detroit. And so Kaytron Allen can be that hammer along with Bill Krosky-Merritt and or Rashad White being the home run threat. And Allen has that consistent performance history through his college seasons that can perhaps be an indicator of him being a sleeper running back to watch in the preseason and in the regular season. The next draft pick I want to mention, he's not going to be a fantasy contributor in a direct way, but I think Washington has a minor hole on their offensive line, and filling that center position is going to be key for protecting Jaden Daniels as well as opening up the running game for Bill, Kaytron Allen, Rashad White, Jerome Ford, Jeremy McNichols, anybody that's going to be handling the rock as the running back. And so this offensive lineman is Matt Gulbin. He's a center from Michigan State who was drafted in the 6th round. He's a former transfer from Wake Forest, and Gulbin's positive performance shows that he only allowed 5 pressures and 2 sacks during his senior season for the Demon Deacons. He was the 2nd-rated center, according to PFF, after he transitioned from left guard, which he played his previous 3 seasons at Wake Forest. And honestly, I don't know a whole lot about him or about any of the centers in the draft, but I do think Gulbin, who was the 2nd best rated center for that year, he could be a contributor. And he's done what he actually performed well in elite competition. His 2nd best graded game was against the national champions Indiana throughout the regular season. So I think that's an encouraging sign as far as his ability to step up and be a potential contributor for his rookie season. And so in terms of the fantasy implications, Tyler Biadasz was mysteriously released by the Commanders in late February without a real replacement in line. And so with the Commanders line being pretty good last season, I think it might be a roll of the dice to try a younger center on a cheap deal that could fill in and still maintain the performance. But there is some potential issues as well, as far as not necessarily his ability to block, but being able to be the leader of the offensive line and call out pass protections, working with Jaden and so on. So just be on the lookout for Gulbin during the rookie mini camp as well as training camp and see how he meshes within the Commanders' offensive line. And then the last draft pick to discuss will be a likely 3rd-string quarterback for the Commanders, potentially, and that is Athan Kaliakmanis. And he is from Rutgers University. He was drafted in the 7th round to compete for the 3rd-string role with Sam Hartman and Josh Johnson if he's been re-signed. And he'll be playing behind Jaden Daniels and Marcus Mariota. Kaliakmanis is a 2-year full-time starter who transferred from University of Minnesota and had an excellent senior season with Rutgers with 20 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. Kaliakmanis had the greatest win above average metric among all drafted prospects, including Sonny Styles. And so again, just to reiterate what the wins above average metric is, it quantifies the ability of a player to make winning plays above an average player in the exact field conditions and scenarios. And so that basically means the Greek god Kaliakmanis, the quarterback out of Rutgers, he did a really good job elevating that Rutgers team beyond their expected level, which could indicate his projection to be a quality backup in the NFL. As far as Kaliakmanis' fantasy implication, and by the way, if I'm mispronouncing his name, someone please hit me a message or shoot me a post on either the Substack or on Spotify, I guess I can just Google it and just make sure that I'm pronouncing his name right. But in terms of the fantasy implications, he is a gamer and has the tools to be a decent future backup. But if he is a non-factor in the fantasy season, the Commanders are doing just fine. But if he's actually contributing to your fantasy team, not only you should be out of your job as a fantasy manager, but most likely Dan Quinn will be out of his job by week 17. So let's hope that Jaden Daniels plays through the whole season. And if he's hurt, that Mariota can step in and get the job done. So let's look at the honorable mentions, specifically the undrafted free agents signed by Washington. And so there are 2 players that I want to mention from this list who could have a shot at a roster spot during the training camp and preseason. So first is Jaden Bradley, wide receiver from UNLV. He is a Hyattsville native who went to the locally acclaimed DeMatha High School. He's transferred a couple times, once from ACC school Pittsburgh and again from Charlotte to UNLV for his redshirt junior and redshirt senior seasons. And he had 4 nondescript seasons before breaking out last year as a senior with 58 catches for 931 yards and 4 touchdowns. So it's hard to explain why he wasn't productive until his last year, but he has that scholastic pedigree from his time at DeMatha, and he actually has the physical tools to be a deep sleeper to make the 53-man roster. So Bradley is 6'4", 195 with decent speed, running a 4.57, and has a RAS score of 7.91. And I emphasize RAS score because it's such a foundational piece of scouting for Adam Peters and the Washington Commanders scouting department. And so Bradley was a bona fide deep threat at UNLV. He averaged 16 yards a catch and has a depth of target of 16.3. So going through his game logs, Bradley did a lot of his damage last season versus Group of 5 FBS or FCS competition. So he may need to turn it up a notch at the NFL level, obviously, because when he did face stronger competition such as Boise State twice and UCLA during the regular season, his catch rate was 20, 50, and 33% respectively. So that's something that he'll have to really hone down when he's facing stiffer competition during training camp into the preseason. But overall, he's still a name to watch just because he has that size, speed combination. And he actually was very, very productive as a deep threat at UNLV. So he's someone that needs to be watched for in training camp to take one of those boundary wide receiver spots if veteran Traylon Burks or Van Jefferson has a slow start in the training camp. Also, the Commanders signed undrafted free agent kicker Drew Stevens out of Iowa. Stevens converted 22 out of 28 kicks last season with 4 kicks beyond 50 yards. And throughout his 4-year career at Iowa, he's converted 76 out of 95 kicks, which is 80%, and 124 out of 126 PATs, which is basically automatic at 98%. And so Stevens has a good leg, converting 12 out of 19 kicks from 50 yards out throughout his career in the Big Ten, where weather conditions are not favorable through the latter part of the season. So Stevens will be a guy that will keep Jake Moody honest come preseason. And Jake Moody is someone that I'm going to talk about here on the next segment. Back here on the Commissioner's Corner podcast. So next segment, we'll be talking about Commanders starters whose roster spot or starting positions are at stake by the new draft picks and their effects on your fantasy football team. So, here in this segment, we'll discuss 3 Washington Commanders players whose spots are vulnerable due to the incoming 2026 NFL class. And let's get right into it. So, the number 3 player that's on the list is Frankie Louvu. And so it seems shocking to put Louvu on the list because he was such a productive player his first year in Washington, and he's always brought that aggressive presence for the defense. But Washington has completed a significant overhaul in free agency, signing Odafe Owe, Kalavion Chasen, and Lionel Chanel to compete at the edge and inside linebacker positions. And so when you also add in stud first-round pick Sonny Styles, who will likely be one of the defensive leaders at inside linebacker, and it's possible that Frankie Louvu loses some snaps based on the down and what personal groupings the opposing offense comes out with. So Louvu is still a big-time player with a lot of juice on the defensive side, but perhaps over the last season he was put too much out there, which kind of exposed some of his weaknesses, especially in coverage. And I believe the defensive coordinator, Durante Jones, will use Louvu more situationally to maximize his aggressive downhill path towards the football. Number 2 on the list is Jake Moody, kicker. And depending on whether your fantasy league rosters kickers, this may be relevant or irrelevant. But the fact is Moody was an in-season signing after former Commanders kicker Matt Gay was released in season. And so Moody did perform well on duty, converting 10 of 11 kicks, and that prompted Washington to re-up him on a 1-year contract. And so in my opinion, kickers in the NFL are broken down into 2 tiers nowadays. One tier, they're all generally very solid with very little difference between the kickers that are on those rosters and unsigned kickers that are free agents. And many of these kickers convert over 80% of their kicks, or approximately 80% of their kicks. And then the elite kickers, the Harrison Butkers, the Brandon Aubreys, the Justin Tuckers. Well, he's a free agent currently, but those kickers convert 90% of their opportunities and can convert big kicks when it matters at the end of the games and especially in the playoffs. So Moody fits the former, and he's a good kicker, but there's really not much distance between him and some of the unsigned kickers that are out there. And in today's NFL, it's always possible to be replaced by a cheaper rookie or free agent if that player performs. And then number 1 on the list is wide receiver Luke McCaffrey. This has been the ultimate elephant in the room all offseason, especially with the Brandon Ayuk trade saga down in San Francisco. And I think this is a position that really needs to be addressed specifically for Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin fantasy owners. And so by Washington drafting Antonio Williams in the 3rd round, this really affects Daniels' fantasy football and overall success because that WR position that is currently occupied by Luke McCaffrey hasn't quite gone as expected. And so McCaffrey hasn't quite put that together, either due to injury or being relegated to the bench to play more of a special teams role. And if you look at his snap counts, the percentage of the snaps that he played in the first 6 weeks of the season sat around 38%. And then that jumped up to 50% before he suffered a season-ending broken collarbone injury in week 8. And so McCaffrey's likely to keep his roster spot on the team due to his kick return abilities. However, on the other hand, he's the prime candidate to lose his starting spot due to some combination of Antonio Williams occupying the Z or flanker role on the field, and especially 2 wideout sets or 3 wideout sets, with Williams occupying the slot and Traylon Burks currently taking the other outside spot with Terry McLaurin. But I even doubt that the Commanders are done addressing this position because there's a lot of talk still surrounding Brandon Ayuk and when he's eventually going to leave the 49ers. And so the big date is June 1st, which is typically the deadline when players are due their roster bonus or there's some sort of kick in their contract where they're due a bunch of money. And so Ayuk is still an intriguing option because he has played with Jaden Daniels at Arizona State. So I think it's the DMV's worst kept secret. I have a theory that because Adam Peters has connections to San Francisco, eventually a deal is going to be done to get Ayuk into Washington, D.C. However, there is another option out there that got a lot of play on the radio waves this week in D.C., specifically Kevin Sheehan's show. And the debate was between Ayuk and also bringing in Stephon Diggs, who is a local DMV native. Shout out to Gaithersburg, Maryland, and Keene Orchard High School. So Diggs is a solid option, and he's going to significantly enhance the Commanders' fantasy prospects and also bring a lot of experience and production to the wide receiver room. He's obviously got a lot of experience as a big-time receiver for Minnesota and Buffalo. He's made a lot of big catches, and he's extremely consistent. He had over 85 catches for over 1,000 yards in a season where people weren't really sure if he still had the juice. But he's still very productive, and personally, in my opinion, I think he's the guy to get for Washington to become a contending team in the NFC East. However, I'll cover a lot of that speculation in a future podcast, as we know that the signings haven't hit the ink hasn't hit the contracts yet. And so once credible reports solidify for those two guys, we'll discuss that in more detail.
Yo, check it.
Leave me your comments on the pod or on the DMV Commish Substack. Thanks to everyone listening to the show. Make sure to subscribe on the Substack. Hit a follow on your podcast streaming service. And see you all in the next episode of the Commissioner's Corner podcast. And to all the mothers and mother figures out there, happy Mother's Day.
Check it.